So this session is going to focus on new research related to performance and resiliency of infrastructure networks, as well as post-disaster connectivity. Let me just get the slide control ready here. And so our first speaker is going to be Mark Eberhard from the University of Washington. And Mark, you should have control over my slides, but there might be a little bit of a lag. Oh, and folks, speakers, please keep in mind, Karina is going to give you a warning at the 4-minute and 30-second mark, just to tell you that you have 30 seconds left. All right, go ahead, Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. This talk is one of the first coming from the engineering side of the collaboration. Jeff Berman is a colleague of mine at UW, and Addie Litterman is a PhD student who's working on the project.
Mark, you muted yourself.
The general area in which we're working is looking at the impact of earthquakes, tsunamis, including liquefaction and landslides and all that. And we're starting off with bridges and probably healthcare systems. And one of the things we want to know from you guys is really other systems we might want to look at that might be high priorities for people. And so the specific part we're looking at is trying to figure out the sensitivity of the assessments we're making on how detailed you are, what level of granularity are we looking at? And that applies to the ground motions. So Erin and her group is coming up with maybe 70 ground motions for a lot of locations. What detail do we need? The inventory, what do we need to know about the inventory? Do we need to be in great detail? Do we need to have some general information? And of course, last one is the modeling, which is what level of modeling is actually appropriate. And there's been a lot of talk by Frank, by Tim, by Brian, and Maximilian about uncertainty. And really, a lot of this has to do with how you handle it. Where's the uncertainty coming from, and to what extent does it affect your decisions? So what we also want to do is to be able to enable studies of social impacts that are important for communities. So without going into a lot of detail, essentially we're looking at very detailed models of ground motions and tsunamis, detailed inventories as much as we can get them, developing very sophisticated models, looking probabilistically at the response and likelihood of the bridges being able to be available. And you can imagine getting all kinds of plots. And here, as an example, we show likelihood of concrete spalling on a bridge as a function of where you are and as a function of the soil conditions. And the idea, of course, is to say, well, that's all great, but what are the social impacts of all that? So we developed this tool in a very sophisticated way, and then turn around and say, well, that's great, but what information do I really need to be able to make a estimate what the social impacts are? Do I need all the details, or can I get away with less? We're starting off with the Olympic Peninsula and the Puget Sound region because we already have information for a lot of bridges. And the Olympic Peninsula is kind of nice because the roadway system is pretty simple. We have to add some more bridges, but we have quite a bit already. And so we can't look at all systems. We have to pick an area, a set of hazards, infrastructure types, specific communities to focus on, and then the risk. Is it just likelihood of casualties, or is there other things we want to look at as well? So what we're hoping to get out of this discussion today and further and future collaborations is really partnerships, areas where people would like us to do these detailed analyses. People who have inventories, people who can help us decide what are the risks we're actually worried about. Is it casualties? Is it islanding? Is it access to healthcare? Is it loss of power? And what social impacts should we focus on? So as we have our discussion today, one of the things we would love is to start partnerships with people who can help us pick which ones of these should be the highest priorities, where we can make the calculations and guide hazards and other tools to make them useful for communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. So just to remind folks, if you're just joining us, we're providing feedback on the Miro board. So the link is in the chat. So it'd be great if you could take some of these questions that Mark posed here and respond to them on the Miro board. And let us know in the chat if you're having trouble doing that. We'll take about a minute to provide some feedback to Mark, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. All right, so finish wrapping up your feedback for Mark on the Miro board. And we're going to move on to our next speaker in this session, who's Murshad Amini. Murshad, you should have control over my screen, but note that there might be a lag when you click.
Perfect, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Murshad Amini. I'm postdoc scholar at Oregon State University. Sorry for my voice. I recently got a cold and still recovering. So today I'm going to talk about the post-earthquake damage, debris loss, and casualty modeling. Yes, so the purpose of this work first is to evaluate the direct economic loss to the built environment and associated risk due to the natural hazard. The second kind of the purpose is to incorporate the impact of earthquake-induced debris on tsunami life safety. And finally, quantify the effect of different mitigation strategies on resilience metrics. So the figure gives you kind of the general idea about the methodology for the multi-hazard direct loss analysis. We have the different modules, including the decision support options. We define the hazard description, built environment, and the social environment, which is more about the population layer. For the fifth module, we have the probabilistic simulation. We can have different modules like building damage model, debris modeling, and earthquake and tsunami casualty. And finally, calculate the risk and select the decision based on the resilience metric for the community. Perfect. So the framework has been implemented for the seaside in Oregon. So in terms of the hazard environments, there are earthquake and tsunami hazard layers for 7 recurrence interval due to the Cascadia subduction zone. For the built environment, we have the building inventory at the parcel level that gives you the building characteristic in terms of the building type, number of the stories, or the seismic code for at each parcel level. And also we have the electric transportation and water supply network for different type of the analysis for the town. And finally, for the socio-economic environment, we have the different population layer for the local, tourists, and employees. And one of the key difference for the city of the seaside, the local population is around the 6,700, but the tourist population can go up to 20,000 for one day in the summer. So we try to capture all these differences. So this slide kind of summarize the required input for the framework. For example, we have the building inventory at the parcel level. We need the tsunami and seismic hazard layer for different recurrence interval. We use the fragility functions for the earthquake and tsunami in order to calculate the damage to the different building and the infrastructure system. And finally, for the casualty modeling, we have the daytime and nighttime population layer and transportation network for the evacuation during the tsunami with the specific tsunami shelters, which can be the horizontal or vertical buildings. Example of the result. So this slide shows you the direct economic loss in terms of at the parcel level and also the total aggregated value for the whole community. The idea was to explore the deaggregation between different infrastructure systems and also between different hazards. And also in order to calculate the risk for different recurrence interval and track the level of the uncertainty for a specific infrastructure systems. And finally, this slide shows kind of the summary of how we implemented the effect of debris on the tsunami evacuation process. So it started with calculating the debris weight at the parcel level, then move forward with distributing the different pieces around the building and calculate the reduction coefficient that affect the initial walking or running speed at each link and the street. So the figure on the top right, as you can see, by including the effect of the debris, the risk for the tsunami casualty can increase significantly by a factor of 8.3. And also we explored the effect of different mitigation strategies, including the tsunami readiness, vertical evacuation, or seismic retrofit of the building for the risk for the tsunami. So for example, for the 1,000 recurrence interval, including the vertical evacuation, the maximum risk can reduce by 65%. And also the more details, we have a paper on the review now, so, and the preprint is available. So just reach me out if you need more information. And finally, for the next step, we're going to conduct the cost-benefit analysis for seismic retrofit options, and we incorporated the casualty modeling to inform the policymaking and land use change modeling. And also, we are willing to implement the algorithm and the method for the potential collaboration with the co-project. Finally, for the stakeholder inputs, so the question can be, what are the policy options worth exploring, and how can we integrate the equity in our policy portfolio? And also, what practical question can be answered with this type of analysis? So please reach out to us with the question, and thank you for your time and attention. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So again, let's hop over to the Miro board. We'd love feedback from both our agency partners as well as COPE Hub people. And so the link is in the chat, and let us know if you need any help. We'll take a minute to provide some feedback now to Mirshad. Okay, so wrap up your thoughts for Mirshad. And now our next talk is going to be given by Dan Cox at Oregon State University. And Dan, you should have control over my slides.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks, everybody. We're going to talk today a little bit about community islanding and the recovery process. So Mirshad just talked a little bit about damage, as well as Mark Eberhardt. But there's also a big question about the recovery. I'm working with some collaborators as well, listed on the screen. And this was a big issue that came up during some of our preliminary stakeholder meetings, in the sense that communities are going to be isolated, cut off from one another, including the inland region. And so what we've decided to work on is a model that looks at the local connectivity. So that's how well we might be connected, for example, from one location to another within a community. And then the other part is a regional connectivity. So how would a single community like Newport be connected to Portland or Medford or one of the other areas? So we developed a model that uses the type of models that were talked about earlier, like HAZUS, where you can shake the ground and damage all the roads and the bridges, and use Ogami's inundation line to estimate what the damage would be. And then we wanted to apply this for 18 cities up and down the coast. And then we wanted to pay particular attention to some of the critical things, like where are the airports, where are the maintenance facilities, and what will the reconstruction process look like. So I'll skip all the details of the modeling and just kind of show some of our results. First question, though, was how well do some of our existing tools work? So originally we thought we could just use HAZUS because it has restoration functions, and that ought to get us a reasonable answer. But it turns out the answer is unreasonably optimistic. It shows that some of the recovery processes, for example, Cannon Beach shown here, if we just applied restoration functions from HAZUS, we would be back in business well within a year, pretty close to back in business within 3 or 4 months. So that's very unrealistic. With the new model that we've built, We look more into the Oregon Resilience Plan and the tiered approach for restoring the different networks. It's totally probabilistic. Each of those gray lines is a roll of the dice. But even within all the uncertainties, that kind of stuff, at least it's, I think, better than HAZUS and is a little bit more realistic in terms of the amount of time. If you look on average, it's saying probably about 2 years for a place like Cannon Beach. So this is incorporating the damage to the valley, but it's really just looking at the local connectivity for Cannon Beach. So how can you get from one place to another in Cannon Beach? 0 to 1, it's really just a normalized scale of like, you know, it normally took me, let's say 20 minutes to get from A to B. If you're at 0.2, it means it's going to take 5 times longer than normal. This is for Port Orford. So this is all the way down south in Oregon. And it's a regional index. So it's like, how long will it take to get from Port Orford to a major airport relative to the case where there was no earthquake and tsunami. And so again, you see the different trajectories, you see all the different gray lines, those are different simulations. And what we're able to do with this kind of model is for a single city like Cannon Beach or Newport or Port Orford, they can look at how connected are they within the community, so that's local, and then how connected are they to resources that they might want to get to outside. And then you can also just compare across cities, like how does Cannon Beach compare to Newport, Port Orford, and so on. So there's 18 cities that we did in total. Next steps. So very excited to work with social science. So instead of like typical engineer, let's look at a critical facility or airport. We really want to work with communities to identify what are the places that are most important to them. So this is work that Jenna Tilt and her students are doing, and seeing how these indices could change just based on preferences that people have on where they want to go. And we presented this to some of the stakeholders out in Newport on Saturday. There's some pretty good feedback. But there were also, I think, more questions, different processes that we could include next time, like landslides and stuff like that. And then getting to mostly community functions, so functional recovery and what are the most important things like food, health, search and rescue, those types of things. So we're just at the beginning stages of this new model and welcome all kinds of feedback and would love to work with people on this one. Thank you, Erin.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. So keeping these questions in mind that Dan posed here, let's move over to the Miro board. Again, the link is in the chat, and feel free to take about a minute or so to leave some feedback for Dan.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next talk. That's going to be given by Joe Lewis at Oregon State University. And Joe, you should have control over the slides.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. Let me see. I just requested control.
Try now.
Yeah, it works now. Thank you. Hey, everyone. So my name is Joe Lewis. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Construction Engineering, OSU. And my research focuses really on how infrastructure damage and functionality loss and the aftermath of disasters will impact the recovery operations that need to be performed. So specifically, we're looking at debris operations, which is integral for business continuity and community recovery. The number cited by FEMA is that it accounts for about 27% of recovery costs. So we're not just talking about the immediate response operations, which is about clearing access routes for first responders and evacuees, but we're also looking long-term at how this debris would need to be disposed and what options are there for that. and what resources are available in local communities for this, so that we can start to rebuild and get back to full functionality. So the goal of this research is really to identify areas that are particularly vulnerable to disasters and quantify operation recovery times and costs by considering infrastructure damage. And primarily, we've been looking at transportation infrastructure damage, just like what we've seen with some of the previous talks. So there are three components that we focus on here. The first one is the debris forecasting part, which has been mentioned. We've been using HAZARDS. It takes inputs like disaster magnitudes to determine how much debris of what type is going to be produced. And it also provides us with the spread of it. So where is this debris going to be? The second portion relates to the infrastructure impacts on access routes, and particularly looking at how long it's going to take for trucks to go from where the debris is to where it needs to go, and how is that going to impact the final recovery times and costs. So for this, we've been using some GIS analysis to bring together route capacities, fragility functions of bridges, and so on, to see what is the shortest route to get to where we need to go and how long that's going to take. And finally, all of this information from the debris forecast, as well as the geospatial analysis, is brought together in this methodology of discrete event simulation. And essentially what we're doing here is we're creating models of recovery operations where we bring together also the equipment availability, the equipment productivities, and disposal strategies. So how can we get rid of debris in terms of we can either incinerate them, take them to landfills, recycle them. And all of these factors can kind of be analyzed holistically to obtain recovery times and costs. So in terms of our application context, we've been focusing on towns on the Oregon coast. So you see here some of the previous screenshots from our work. And the first one just shows, focusing on debris spread in Astoria it was, and identifying where these debris might be processed before being taken for final disposal. The second picture shows you how we can determine the optimal routes considering bridge damage. And I think that was done for the town of Coos Bay, where one of these bridges was found to not be capable of handling truckloads moving after disaster. So we found an alternative route. And you see in the third image, we see how all of this information is brought together along with logistical constraints and space constraints at landfills to see how these operations might progress through time to get us estimates of recovery times and costs. So the outcomes are expected to be useful for emergency planning and resource allocation. And looking forward at next steps, just moving forward, we want to incorporate other types of infrastructure damage that might impair access to affected communities, as well as to the infrastructure that's needed for processing debris. So we're looking at incorporating maps of landslides, flooding, and even fire-related hazard trees and so on to see what road blockages might be caused by these disasters. So for instance, in this image that you see here, we used a fire simulation to try and recreate the 2020 Labor Day fires in Eastern Oregon to see how that might impact roadway networks and quantify damage in terms of how many hazard trees need to be removed, how much debris needs to be removed, and what impact it's going to have on travel times and so on.
30 seconds left.
So, it's really great to have all of you on this call, and some of the input that we'd like to get from you moving forward is what type of repair operations do you perform for your assets, and how do you prioritize this repair work and access to your assets? This would really help us prioritize some of the work that we could be doing and focusing on as we move forward. And also, if you could include some information of whether you self-perform this repair work or contract it out, that would be great to know. So thank you all again for your time, and look forward to getting some feedback from you. Thanks, Aaron.
Great. Thank you very much.